The first thing to say is, because I'm the editor of that Living Climate Jobs booklet, and I'm the International Secretary of the Campaign Against Climate Change, I do an awful lot of meetings for the Campaign Against Climate Change, which is a very broad church indeed. Tonight's talk is not the Campaign Against Climate Change, it's the Revolutionary Socialist talk. So this is just me, rather than speaking for the whole campaign. That's the first thing to say. I'm not going to tell you much about the science of climate change because, thankfully, most people now understand the basics, and particularly people who will come to this meeting. I think you pretty much understand the basics. But I want to start off with two things that I think need to be emphasized about what's going to happen. The first one is the importance of feedback effects. We know from past geological history that when the world gets cooler, it gets cooler steadily. It's a steady downward movement of getting cooler and cooler and cooler over tens of thousands of years. When the world warms up, it warms up very slowly and steadily for a long time, and then there's a sudden burst in the temperature and in the level of carbon dioxide in the air. And the scientists know that the only way that can be happening is if there's a feedback effect or feedback effects that suddenly kick in. So we know that that is going to happen. We don't know what feedback effect is going to be critical. There are quite a few that are possible. Every one that the scientists have posited might be going to happen, they've gone out into nature and measured it to see if it's happening, and all of them are happening. But we don't know which ones will be critical. But we do know that at a certain point, we're going to be facing runaway climate change. We don't know when that point is either. In the nature of a feedback effect, we don't know when it is. We do know that we're forcing the pace much faster, much faster than it has ever been forced by nature before. We know that in times of that for hundreds of thousands of years, the world has been going back and forth between ice ages and temperate ages. In the ice age, the level of carbon dioxide in the air is 180 parts per million. Don't worry about what parts per million means. 180 carbon dioxide in the air. In temperate times, like 1900, the amount is 280. So it's a shift from an ice age to a temperate of 100, from 180 to 200. It's now 400, just pushing 401. So we have seen, in the last century, we have seen more change than between an ice age and a temperate region. And I think the figure is that half of that change has happened in the last 35 years. So we are really forcing the pace. That's the first thing, is that we're forcing the pace and we'll hit feedback effects. The second thing is that the physical effects of climate change will take place within the social and economic system that governs the world now. That system is capitalism. And what that system does is it turns a natural disaster into a human catastrophe. So, for instance, we will have very widespread changes in the pattern of rainfall. In many places, much less rainfall. In some places, very large amounts of rainfall, but at the wrong time of year and in torrential downpours, so they cause floods and they cannot be used for growing crops. What this will mean is that in large areas of the world, there will be smaller crops and smaller harvests than usual. What that means with capitalism is you also get famines. Again, as the hurricanes move north in the northern hemisphere, south in the southern hemisphere, and become stronger and stronger, the effect of the what's called a hurricane surge, which is basically a tsunami that comes with the hurricane. Hurricane Katrina, which was a very small hurricane, a Category 2 hurricane in New Orleans in 2005, when that when the hurricane surge hit the land, it was 9 meters high. So if the big coastal cities of the world are hit by tsunamis that are 15, 20 meters high, if there is also widespread starvation and so on, what you will get is enormous numbers of refugees. In the system we live in now, those refugees come up against borders patrolled by men and women with machine guns. And the refugee camps, the tents, will stretch for miles, and people will live there for years. And on the other side of the border, there will be a massive increase in racism to justify keeping those desperate people out. Often quite new racisms, because there'll be new kinds of desperate people. The third thing that we will get with capitalism is we will get war. If you change the geographical balance of power, the great powers and the small powers will go to war to restore the balance in their favor. That combination, if you think of that combination of famine, mass refugees, war, that's not a science fiction prediction. If you want to see what that looks like, look at Darfur and Kordofan and Sudan and Somalia and Chad. The rains failed there because of climate change in 1969 and have never really recovered. Some years are worse than other years. In Darfur, they held it together. They didn't start killing each other as a result until the 1980s. They had very strong social ties holding people together and so on, but in the 1980s they began to kill each other. Basically, there's an enormous amount of great power meddling in the neighbors, sending in arms and all that kind of stuff in Darfur, but fundamentally at the base of it, it's farmers and herders killing each other for disappearing grass. That is going to be what happens in much of the world. It's also going to be when climate change hits, when runaway climate change hits, there will be a very large number of extreme climate events happening around the world, and several happening in one country in the same year. The economic, first of all, the economic destruction is going to be enormous. The destruction of property, of factories, of values, of refineries, and so on. But also, the authorities will react with brute force. What we will see is the tanks on the streets. And with the tanks will come a set of the men in charge of the tanks, and they'll mostly be men, will come with a set of politics that will sound very environmental. That will sound deep green. We're all about, we all have to sacrifice. This is a time of austerity. We can dispense with the usual civil liberties and so on. We all have to pull together. But as always when they say that, we will sacrifice and they will not. And there will be the heel of dictatorship on our necks. Okay, that's what we face. We can't, in the nature of things, we can be pretty sure there will be hundreds of thousands dead. How many hundreds of thousands, we can't really know. But worse, certainly worse than the worst event of the 20th century, which was the Second World War. Much worse than that. But perhaps the worst thing will be what people have to witness and what they have to do to survive that time. And the long-term effect that has on those people and on human society. Okay, that's the bad news. We don't know the timing, as I said, we don't know the timing. We may have 40 or 50 years. We may have 5 or 10 years. A reasonable guess is 20 years, but it's only a guess. We probably have a generation, probably we have a generation to do something about it, and probably it's going to happen in the lifetime of the majority of people in this world. For people like Neale, I can be sure of this, it will happen in the lifetime of some people I love. That's the situation. As I said, the good news is we can stop it. Whenever humanity decides to stop it, we can stop it, and we can stop it very, very quickly. This booklet on 1 million climate jobs that's put out by the Campaign Against Climate Change and 7 different British unions and the National Union of Students. We've done a lot of work for that over the years, and there's do buy the booklet at the end of this, but there's also 40,000 words on the internet of background statistical studies and so on, which I edited and I would dearly like somebody to read. And so on. We've had a lot of scientists and economists and so on doing the research for us. But what it lays out for this country works in somewhat different forms everywhere in the world. What we have to do to stop climate change, we can't basically do it by reducing our standard of living. The reason is we need cuts globally on the scale of about 90%. We can't reduce the global standard of living by 90%. We have to do things differently. What that means literally thousands of things that we have to do, but 3 of them are going to make most of the difference to emissions. The first is in this country to insulate and renovate all of the buildings. The public buildings, the business buildings, people's homes, renovate and insulate all of them so that we use much less energy for heating homes and water. The second one is to change the transport system so that we get out of cars mostly and we get into public transport that goes whenever you want, that runs all night, that runs to villages all night, that comes, that's reliable, that's clean, that's quick, and so on. The third thing we need to do is to cover the world with renewable energy. In Britain that means mainly wind energy. Because in Britain we are blessed with endless supplies of bad weather. And this means that we have in North Sea wind and the wind in the Irish Sea, we have one of the great resources of renewable energy in Europe. But we need all kinds of renewable energy because for technical reasons, we can go into the discussion if you want, you need to mix them all together to have a reliable electricity supply. And we need enough to cover not only all the electricity uses we have now, but electricity to cover all of public transport and all of cars and all of the heating of houses and all, to cover everything from renewable electricity. That's what we need to do. Our calculations are that we can cut carbon dioxide with 1 million workers hired by the government in 20 years can cut carbon dioxide emissions in this country by 86%. And greenhouse gas emissions overall by 83%. If we had 2 million workers, we could do it in 12 years. And that is with the technology we have today, not assuming anything new is invented, although of course things will be invented. But with the technology we have today, we can do that. And we can do it globally on the same scale. That requires enormous public investment. I can come back to the details how we get that public investment in this country and so on. But it requires that the government intervenes, that we make the government intervene and do something for the sake of the climate. It also means that we would take 1 million people off the dole in this country. Globally, we take about 120 million people off the dole, and there are many more than 120 million people in the world who need a job. Okay, that's what we have to do. When you say what we have to do, then you also see why it's so difficult to do it. Now, it's difficult to do it because the problem is capitalism. Now, I don't just mean the problem is a theoretical and abstract capitalism. I could write you a textbook about what capitalism is, and I could show you how we could solve climate change within capitalism. The problem is the actually existing capitalism we've got, the actually existing set of social relations we have, make it very difficult because of what needs to be done. And that happens in more than one way. The first and most obvious way is that a change to a low-carbon economy means the corporate debt of the high-carbon corporations, coal, gas, oil, cars. And those are very powerful corporations. It's not affecting all corporations by any means, but those are very powerful corporations. Last year, in the Fortune 500 list of the 500 largest corporations in the world by sales, the top 10 corporations globally, 6 of them were oil companies, 3 of them were car companies, 1 of them was Walmart, a giant parking lot. Much of British politics can be explained by the fact that of the 5 largest corporations in the world, 2 are British. One is BP and one is Shell. And if you wish to understand our energy policy or our foreign policy, that's what you need to know. So there is that. But that in itself is not an insuperable barrier. In the up until 2008, 2009, there were a lot of politicians of the center-right who wanted to do something about climate change, who were speaking for corporations and governments as a whole, not just for the oil companies. George Bush spoke for the oil companies, but you got a lot of politicians, not left-wing people, who wanted to do something about climate change. Tony Blair, Angela Merkel, Sarkozy, Al Gore, probably the most representative figure, Arnold Schwarzenegger. These people seriously wanted to do something. But they wanted to do it without giving up neoliberalism, without giving up austerity. And they couldn't give that up because I'll do this real fast, so I'll do it real crude. There's been a problem in the industrial countries with profits in industry since the late 1960s. All over the rich countries, profits went down in the 1960s and have never really recovered. And the response of governments and corporations across the world was led by Margaret Thatcher and by Ronald Reagan's government, and it was to squeeze, in order to keep profits up, to squeeze the incomes of everybody else. And that's what the anti-trade union laws are about. It's what the cuts in public expenditure are about, the ripping up of environmental controls, the ripping up of health and safety controls, the privatization of everything, the contracting out of everything. What all of these do is try and increase the share of the national income going to profits, to get it back up because their economic system is not working. That was half of what they did. The other half of neoliberalism is the idea that you can't change anything. And that idea that you can't really fight the system, you can't really change anything, that's an idea that's in all of our heads. That's their biggest weapon, is that an awful lot of the time we believe that now. They act on climate change. If we build a movement that gets 1 million jobs to do something about the climate, then everybody's going to say, well, if we can do it for the atmosphere, why can't we do it for the hospitals? Why can't we do it for the schools? Why can't we do it for my pension? Everybody's going to say that. And all that they built up with neoliberalism, with austerity, they're going to lose. So, the Gores, the Blairs, the Merkels, they wanted to do something, but within those limits. But they did really want to do something. And now they don't. The year it changed was 2009. The year they tore up any attempt from the top to do anything. And think the reason they did it is that it was 2009. That there was a global financial crisis. In the wake of the financial crisis of 2008, nobody, no big institution in capitalism, no corporation was safe. General Motors, the largest industrial corporation in the world for 60 years, went broke. Greece can go broke. Argentina went broke. Russia went, no, they went broke before that. But suddenly nobody is safe. They decided they couldn't, no bit of the system, no country thought they could afford to be the leaders to push it forward. And so now you get a situation where going into Paris in December 2015, there are global talks that are going to decide the future until 2030. We already know what the result will be because the United States and China have already come to an agreement about what they're doing. An agreement by the United States and China says that if you take the emissions of the United States and China together, that those will continue to grow as a total until 2030. At which point they will start to come down again, and somewhere between 2040 and 2045, those emissions will be down to where they are now, which is insupportable. Okay. What this means is we're going to have to build a mass movement. We're going to have to build a mass movement that's going to force the leaders of the world to do it. The chances of doing that are much better than they have ever been. And maybe we'll come back to it in discussion. But it started with the movements against fracking and against the tar sands pipeline in Canada, led by the First Nations people, the Aboriginal people of Canada. And then spreading down into the United States and spreading across Europe, and we've had our own delightful fracking movement here and so on. It started with that, but there are, I think, two key breakthroughs, moments. That gave people confidence. But the real breakthrough, I think, was in September in New York. There was a demonstration of between 300,000 and 400,000 people about climate change in the most backward country on earth. And that demonstration, for the first time just about ever for a big environmental demonstration, that demonstration was not white. And it was not posh. That demonstration looked and felt and dressed like the people of New York in all the variety of different dress. And the reason for that, more than anything else, was Hurricane Sandy, which had come straight into the black working class, Latino working class neighborhoods, which are down on the shore. And people knew that this was only the beginning. That means that we are in a window where the movement is going to grow. We will need, however, a very large movement. That's why campaigning for climate jobs is so important, because we have to have the majority with us. We have to have the majority of people with us. We have to have, to win this one, we've got to have the majority of farmers and workers in India and China fighting for it. We're not going to do that if we say this is about sacrifice. We have to say this is about doing things utterly differently. This is not about keeping poor countries poor. It's about poor countries having, poor people having all the electricity they need, and it is built on solar power. That's what we have to do. Now, can we do it? I don't know. I would assume that the majority of people in this room have lain awake at night, at least once, and some of you many times, thinking about, can we stop climate change? Given what we need to do, can we stop climate change? I have too. And I think the odds are that we're going to fail. That's my judgment. But I think it's a matter of odds. And I think we're in now with a reasonable chance. speed at which the movement is growing, but also the enormous change in the feel of the movement, the enormous change in the set of politics that you're getting from the climate movement, from what we had last time around in 2008, 2009. It's very striking. Naomi Klein, with her book that says Capitalism is the problem, and we've got to get rid of capitalism to solve that problem, she filled Westminster Central Hall in London. In my lifetime, no one left-wing intellectual has ever filled Westminster Central Hall. The residents, the young people building the demonstration March the 7th with, they're different. They're different, I think, because they also are the products of 2008 and 2009. Because on some level, people have had enough. But two problems remain. Well, there are two that I can address tonight. One is, I don't think we say to people, well, the problem is capitalism. We're going to have a revolution. We're not going to stop climate change otherwise. Why don't you join RS-21? Don't think that's going to work. I don't think it's going to work. Because what people hear when you say the problem is capitalism and we're going to do a revolution, what people hear is we can't do anything about it. That neoliberal voice that says we can't change the world. They hear we can't do anything about it. But they also hear that you're trying to make political capital out of the situation. You're trying to jam your own particular understanding on people. I think what I say is something quite different. I say what I really think, which is, I don't know if we can solve this problem with capitalism. After all, we built a welfare state without getting rid of capitalism. They're trying to take it away from us again. But my grandparents' years built that. Maybe we can do it. Maybe we can do it within the system we've got. Maybe we can't. But I think the thing to say is that we have to do it. And let's join hands and walk down the road together and see what we need to do to solve this problem. How long have I got? 5 minutes or 10 minutes?
Well, we've gone over what we were originally going to do, but...
Fine. Okay. So I think what we say is, let's try. Let's be prepared to be absolutely as radical as we need to be. But let's try in every possible way to solve the problem in the circumstances we have now. The last thing I'd like to, if I've got time, is to say, I think one of the difficulties with talking to people about revolution, about changing the world, is we've lost the idea of what another world would be like. We've lost that idea because communism turned into an abomination. Because Labour Party, the social democracy, the national independence movements in Africa and Asia and so on, they've died a slower death. But the hopes that so many people put in those parties and those movements too are ashes in our mouth. And so I think I have to say what I mean by socialism, what I mean about what another world would be like. For me, first of all, nothing like the old communist governments. Socialism is not the tanks and it's not the secret policeman bullet in the back of somebody's head in a cell. That's not socialism. It will be enormous democracy. Democracy of daily life. Fundamentally what we have now is we vote every once in a while, but every time we go to work or to college, every morning we walk into a dictatorship. And that forms who we are. what kind of people we are, what kind of feelings it forms us deeply. That's what makes everything so undemocratic. So we need to elect the people who boss us at work, and people like us. We need to elect from every workplace, or, you do special things for people in high schools and for retired people and so on, but basically elect representatives who are the kind of people we work with, who we can get rid of on Friday if we want to, and we will do that a great deal, and who are not lawyers from someplace else, but are cleaners and IT technicians like us. And so we need to do that. But we also need to take over collectively the decision-making about the whole market. I live in a housing association which I helped found out as a squatting movement, which now evicts people. I worked for 10 years of my life, best job I ever had, in a feminist abortion cooperative. And in the end, the board of directors laid us all off because we were paid too much. Any of you who've ever worked for the co-op, it is, if you take over a piece of the world economy, the laws of the market bear down on you. So what we need is people democratically elected who come together to decide what the market does, to decide fundamentally what jobs we do, what work we do. Some people, I don't know what decisions to make. Some people will want to put a lot more labor, take labor out of the advertising industry, take it all out of the advertising industry, and put much more labor into old people's homes. Some people want to close all of the old people's homes. Some people want to put all the extra labor into more public music. Some people will want to put the labor into making the poor countries richer much faster, and so on. Some people will want to get rid of Monday and Tuesday. Do you know what I mean? It will be... The fundamental thing is that we will be collectively making those decisions, what we want to do with labor. The next thing is we'll be an equal world. A world in which everybody is paid the same. A bit more if you've got more needs or whatever. But a world in which everybody is paid the same, in which everybody's labor is equally socially valued. I don't know what all the decisions will be, because it's hard to imagine some of them, but I have lived in working class communities in 3 continents. And one thing I know is that it will be a world where people have security. Where nobody ever again has to stay up late at night, frightened because they can't afford the medicines for their children. Where nobody is afraid of what will happen once they get old and start to fall down. Where those fears are gone. What it will do to domestic lives, and this is 1 minute now, what it will do to domestic lives, to our loving lives and so on, and our families, I don't know. I think we'll still love children. I think we'll still be trying to love each other, maybe in completely different ways. But we'll be doing it as equals, and we'll be doing it as people who are not afraid. And the last thing I know is that if we can do this, 2 things. If we can do this, the real change will be in the people who grow up in a new and different world. Because you and me, we've already got the scars. We will never get over a lot of that. But if you can imagine what it is like to grow up without fear, look into the eyes of a baby who is fed, not the hungry babies in the world. Look into the eyes of a baby and see what's in those eyes. And imagine the 20-year-old who still has that in their eyes. That's what I want to fight for. And that is a world worth having. And I don't know if we'll get it, I think we can get it. But the last thing to say is it's also a world where we'll stop climate change. And if the ravages of climate change are hitting us, we will take care of it. Take care of our neighbors and take care of each other globally. And the last thing is why all this matters. Climate change matters in a way that none of the issues before in my life have mattered, because this is a one-off thing. The others are all long, long struggles. But climate change will be decided in the next 2 generations. And I care most about people. But we also have to understand that by an accident of evolution, because we have big brains and opposable thumbs, we have stewardship now. We have custody of every living thing. The scientists are guessing what proportion of species we will lose if we allow climate change. And the guesses run from 30% to 70%. The truth is probably not. But that is what we hold in our hands. And in the next 2 generations, we will see what people are made of. What kind of an animal humanity is. I hope it turns out all right, and let's spend the rest of our